There are people who talk endlessly about their own lives and yet feel like they are hardly living at all. They share plans, explain their pain, narrate intentions, justify choices. Words flow easily, but something essential remains still, as if speaking replaced acting, as if saying were safer than being. There is a strange comfort in talking about oneself, a momentary relief. By telling the story, the person feels they have organized their inner chaos. By explaining, they believe they have understood. By sharing, they imagine they have moved forward. But once the immediate effect fades, everything remains the same. The same restlessness, the same frustrations, the same cycles. This habit is rarely seen as a problem. On the contrary, it is often viewed as a sign of awareness, emotional openness, depth. But there is a subtle difference between reflecting and repeating, between processing and ruminating, between naming things and using names as a substitute for change. Many people live trapped in this circular motion. They talk about what they want to change, but they do not change. They talk about who they want to be, but they stay where they are. They talk about freedom yet remain conditioned. Words create the feeling of movement, while real life stays suspended. The psychological root of this behavior is old and quiet. Talking about one's own life is a way of maintaining symbolic control. As long as one is talking, nothing needs to be decided. As long as one is explaining, nothing needs to be confronted. As long as one is narrating, the risk of action is postponed. Carl Jung observed that human beings create narratives to tolerate their own stagnation. The story one tells about oneself begins to matter more than real transformation. The person identifies with the discourse, not with the process, and this creates a subtle trap. The more one talks, the less one acts. There is also a powerful social component. We live in a culture that rewards expression, not necessarily coherence. Those who speak well about themselves seem aware. Those who verbalize pain seem deep. Those who expose conflicts seem mature. Few notice that true maturity rarely needs to be announced. Stoicism looks at this with rigor. For the Stoics, life is not measured by what is said, but by what is practiced. Epictetus warned that it is not enough to understand what is good. You must act accordingly. Otherwise, knowledge becomes useless weight. When someone talks too much about their own life, they are often trying to convince themselves of something they are not yet living. The discourse functions as an internal promise, a promise repeated so many times that it begins to sound true, even without ever becoming real. This pattern forms early. From a young age, many learn that explaining is enough, that recognizing a problem is already half the solution, that naming a feeling is the same as transforming it. To a point, this is true, but only up to a point. After that, words stop being a bridge and become a hiding place. There is a legitimate fear behind this excessive speech, the fear of silence, because silence does not negotiate. It does not accept justifications. In silence, there is no narrative to lean on, only the distance between who you are and who you say you are. Talking fills that space. It fills the void. It lowers the tension, but it does not resolve the conflict. Seneca warned that a restless mind constantly seeks external relief. Sometimes that relief comes as distraction, other times as words. The problem is that momentary relief weakens the willingness to engage in real effort. Another important psychological aspect is the identity built around discourse. Some people see themselves as those who reflect deeply, who analyze everything, who speak profoundly about life. Questioning excessive talk feels like a threat to that identity, as if silence were regression, not progress. But Stoicism draws a clear distinction between reflection and verbal excess, internal or external. To reflect is to examine with the intention of acting better. To talk without acting is merely spinning in place. When someone spends a lot of time talking about their projects, desires, and conflicts, an artificial familiarity with these ideas develops. They stop causing discomfort. They lose urgency. The brain interprets talking as a form of partial completion, and so action loses its force. This is a common interpretive error. believing that verbal awareness equals transformation. It does not. Transformation requires friction. It requires discomfort. It requires choices that cannot be replaced by explanations. Stoicism does not despise words, but it subordinates them to practice. For Epictetus, saying that something matters has no value if daily behavior does not confirm it. Life, for him, is the final argument. Jung also saw clearly that excessive talk about oneself can be a way of inflating the persona. The image presented to the world, and to oneself, begins to replace inner reality. The person relates more to the idea of who they are than to the process of becoming. This creates an internal split. On the outside, discourse. On the inside, stagnation. That split is exhausting, and over time, it produces cynicism. The person begins to stop believing their own words, yet keeps talking because they do not know what to put in their place. Silence in this context is frightening, because in silence there are no alibis, no stories, no audience. Only naked awareness facing its own condition. Stoicism values this silence deeply, not as the absence of thought, but as a space for honest observation, where one notices how much talking is used to avoid doing, how much explaining replaces deciding, how much rationalizing replaces changing. Even so, this initial perception does not bring immediate clarity. It disturbs. It provokes resistance. The mind defends itself. It says that talking helps, that sharing is healthy, that thinking out loud is growth. All of this can be true, but only up to the point where speech begins to replace action. The difference is subtle and personal. It cannot be measured from the outside. It can only be felt internally. That sense that, despite all the words, something remains stuck. That one knows too much and does too little. That life is being commented on, not lived. Stoicism calls this the incoherence between logos and praxis, between understanding and conduct. Not as an accusation, but as a diagnosis. As long as this incoherence exists, suffering remains, because the mind knows what should be done but does not do it. And that gap creates constant tension. That tension is often anesthetized with more words, more explanations, more analyses, more conversations about the same subject. The cycle feeds itself. But at some point, something begins to fail. Words lose their effect. Explanations sound empty. The advice one gives others begins to expose one's own immobility, and a new discomfort appears, a more honest one. The sense that maybe it is necessary to be quiet in order to see, to stop talking about life and finally observe it, to stop narrating and begin carrying the weight of real choices. This idea is not yet clear. It is only approaching. It still generates fear, because it implies losing the shield of discourse. It implies abandoning an identity built around what is said. It implies facing silence without intermediaries. This initial awareness ends here, not with answers but with an open tension. The tension between continuing to talk about one's life or risking actually living it without so many explanations. Between maintaining the safety of discourse or facing the quiet honesty of action. Something begins to move inside. An uncomfortable suspicion. Maybe speaking less is not impoverishment. Maybe it is the beginning of something more real. But this possibility has not yet been examined deeply. It simply hovers, demanding attention, demanding courage, demanding a closer look at the patterns that repeat whenever words replace life. When you begin to observe more honestly, it becomes clear that talking about your own life is not a neutral act. It follows patterns. It repeats itself at specific moments. It almost always appears when something should be done, decided, or confronted. Speech shows up as a comfortable bridge between intention and action, a bridge that never actually reaches the other side. There are people who talk about change whenever they feel uncomfortable, but they do not change. They talk about courage when they are afraid, but they do not move forward. They talk about purpose when they feel lost, but they do not choose. The discourse works like an emotional shock absorber. It reduces internal pressure without demanding real transformation. This pattern shows up in everyday life in subtle ways. long conversations about plans that never leave the page, detailed analyses of past mistakes, without concrete adjustments in the present, deep reflections shared with others, while small daily decisions continue to be avoided. The common interpretive mistake is believing that the problem is a lack of opportunity, time, or support. But when you look more closely, you see that opportunities do appear, time is spent on narratives, and support is often sought more to validate the discourse than to sustain action. Stoicism draws attention to this by reminding us that virtue is not proven by words but by consistency. Epictetus harshly criticized those who spoke beautifully about philosophy, but lived like everyone else. To him, this was not neutrality, but self-deception. Another recurring pattern is repeated confession. The person talks about their flaws, their limitations, their failures. They seem humble, aware, open. But when this confession is repeated without practical change, it turns into identity. "This is just how I am," is said naturally, as if recognition were an endpoint, not a starting point. This creates a deep emotional consequence. The person begins to feel that they have already done everything they could simply by recognizing the problem. Action starts to feel redundant, unnecessary, almost unfair to themselves. After all, they already know, they already talked, they already reflected. Jung saw in this movement an inflation of consciousness. When someone believes that intellectually understanding something is the same as integrating it, a false sense of progress is created. The unconscious, however, is not persuaded by words. It responds to repeated actions. There is also the pattern of constant exposure. Talking about one's life to many people, in many contexts, as if that guaranteed authenticity. But the more one talks, the more something essential is lost. The inner space where transformation happens without an audience. Stoicism values discretion, not secrecy, but effectiveness. What is still in process weakens when it is exposed too early. Premature speech dissipates the energy needed to sustain effort. The long-term emotional consequences are clear. The person begins to feel empty, despite talking so much. Feels like they have been repeating the same speeches for years. Feels a quiet shame for not matching their own narrative. And to relieve that shame, they talk even more. A difficult cycle is created. Words relieve the tension caused by lack of action. Lack of action sustains the need to talk. And time passes. Stoicism sees this cycle as a form of internal enslavement, not to circumstances, but to one's own discourse. The person starts protecting the image built with words, even when that image no longer matches lived reality. Another frequent mistake is confusing silence with repression. Many believe that stopping talking about their own life means denying feelings or ignoring conflicts. But Stoic silence is not denial. It is conscious restraint. It is choosing the right moment to act instead of speaking. In daily life, this shows up in small choices. Instead of telling everyone about a plan, quietly carrying it out. Instead of explaining why something hurts, adjusting boundaries. Instead of narrating intentions, sustaining coherent behavior. These choices create initial discomfort because they remove the immediate relief that speech provides. But they also generate something new, inner consistency. Over time, those who speak less about themselves begin to notice something curious. Less need for approval, less urgency to be understood, less dependence on others' reactions. The energy once spent on explanations begins to concentrate on action. Even so, this process is not linear. The temptation to talk returns, especially in moments of insecurity, especially when change has not yet produced visible results. Talking feels easier than sustaining the silence of construction. Stoicism does not romanticize this effort. It recognizes that changing internal patterns requires constant vigilance. It requires noticing when words are being used as escape, when discourse serves only to relieve the anxiety of not living as one wishes. Little by little, it becomes evident that excessive talk is not just a social habit, but a psychological protection mechanism. Protection from real failure, from the risk of trying and not succeeding, from the possibility of acting and discovering limits. As long as one talks, failure remains hypothetical. As soon as one acts, it becomes possible. And that is what many avoid without realizing it. This understanding deepens the tension that began earlier, because now it is not just about talking too much, but about avoiding confrontation with one's own capacity to act, avoiding the test of reality, avoiding the silence where there are no excuses. The mind begins to realize that continuing to speak in the same way will have the same effect as always: none. And that realization creates a different kind of discomfort. A discomfort that no longer asks for more words, but for a different posture. It is not yet the complete turning point. There is still resistance, still attachment to discourse. But something begins to shift. The idea that perhaps less speech does not mean less depth, but more truth. That idea starts to gain strength, not as a conclusion, but as a persistent unease. An unease that accompanies every new explanation, every repeated narrative, every conversation where much is said and little is done. The mind begins to ask itself, more seriously, whether it is using language as a substitute for life, whether it is hiding behind its own capacity for analysis, whether it is trading the risk of action for the safety of discourse. This question does not seek an immediate answer. It simply remains. It grows. It presses. And it is precisely this pressure that prepares something different. A shift in perspective. A displacement of the internal axis. Something that cannot be explained in words, only lived. The turning point has not yet happened. But the ground is ready, because when words lose their power to anesthetize, consciousness begins to demand coherence. And that demand starts pointing toward a place where speaking less is not impoverishment, but a necessary condition. To finally see what happens when life stops being commented on and begins to be faced with presence, silence, and responsibility. This is where most people make a decisive mistake. They believe that excessive talking is just a personality trait, when in reality, it is a symptom of something deeper. The difficulty of sustaining one's own life without intermediaries. Talking becomes a psychological crutch, a way of staying in motion without actually going anywhere. The turning point begins when it becomes clear that stagnation is not maintained by a lack of clarity, but by an excess of it. Clarity that never turns into action. The person knows what should change, knows what is wrong, knows what bothers them, and precisely because they know so much, they believe they have already done enough. This is the central error. Stoicism is unforgiving on this point. Knowledge has no value without practice. Understanding does not transform. Awareness alone is not enough. Epictetus said that one should not explain how life should be lived, but live as it should be lived. Everything else is noise. Most people go wrong because they try to resolve existential discomfort on the level of language. They use words to organize what can only be reorganized through decisions. They use explanations to ease the weight of postponed choices. They use reflection to avoid the risk of concrete failure. Here, the problem stops being talking too much and becomes avoiding the cost of action. Because acting exposes you. You act, and something happens. You act, and you can fail. You act, and the fantasy breaks. As long as you talk, everything remains possible. Once you act, something becomes real. Short phrases begin to assert themselves internally, almost like strikes of clarity. Words do not replace character. Discourse does not build a life. What is not lived becomes a burden. These phrases do not motivate. They cut. Carl Jung observed that what is not lived consciously returns as fate. Excessive talking in this sense is an attempt to maintain symbolic control over something that requires real commitment. But life does not negotiate with symbols. It responds only to actions. The Stoic reframing is simple and severe. Talking about your life is not wrong. Turning it into a substitute for action is. When words come too far ahead of experience, they lose value. When narrative precedes living, it creates illusion. The shift in awareness happens when silence is understood not as emptiness but as a testing ground. In silence, there is no audience, no external reinforcement, no applause, only your own willingness to sustain choices without witnesses. This is frightening because it exposes limits. Without words, what remains is what you are capable of doing now, not tomorrow, not when you feel ready. Now. Stoicism calls this focusing on what depends on us, not as an abstract concept, but as daily discipline. What depends on me today is not explaining my pain but acting coherently despite it. Not justifying my failures, but adjusting my behavior. Not narrating intentions, but sustaining small decisions. Most people prefer to keep talking because talking preserves the old identity. Acting requires abandoning it. Acting requires accepting that we may not be who we imagined ourselves to be. And that wounds the ego. Discourse protects the ego. Action confronts it. This is where limits come in. Internal limits not announced. Limits that say, I will no longer use words to relieve the discomfort of not living as I think. I will no longer explain why I didn't act. I will no longer turn reflection into an alibi. These limits are not declared to others. They are assumed in silence. Reason begins to operate more firmly, not allowing every unease to turn into conversation, not allowing every doubt to become discourse. Some doubts need to become experience. Some unease needs to become decision. Control at this stage takes on a deeper meaning. It is not controlling what you say, but controlling when words are being used as escape. It is noticing the impulse to talk and instead staying with the discomfort, staying with the tension, staying in the silence that demands later action. Few people endure this stage, because it offers no immediate relief. It offers only responsibility. Responsibility for what you do when no one is listening. The shift in awareness does not make a person more eloquent. It makes them more sober, less concerned with being understood, more concerned with being coherent. Something changes in posture. The body slows down. Speech decreases. The gaze becomes more attentive. The energy once spent on explanations begins to concentrate on execution. This is the point where life starts to respond, not because the world changes, but because the relationship with it changes. Fewer expectations, fewer narratives, more presence. But this shift is not the end. It prepares the ground for something more demanding, living according to this insight in daily life. Not as an ideal, but as a simple practice, as a way of speaking less, observing more, and acting when necessary. The mind has already realized that excessive discourse was a form of delay. Now it begins to suspect that silence may be a form of progress, not empty silence, but silence charged with intention. Something essential is about to solidify, not as theory, but as a way of living. A clarity that does not ask for explanation, a posture that does not seek validation. A way of existing where life no longer needs to be constantly commented on, because it finally begins to be sustained by real choices. This clarity still demands application. It demands translation into concrete actions. It demands discipline. It demands quiet courage. And this is exactly what begins to form now as reason, less seduced by its own words, prepares to assume definitive command of practical life, transforming silence into criterion, action into language, and coherence into the central axis of everything that follows. The climax does not happen when a person stops talking. It happens when they understand why they were talking so much, when they realize, without drama, that words had become an elegant substitute for responsibility. At that point, something stabilizes internally. There is no need to announce changes, no urge to explain the process, no anxiety about being understood. The energy once scattered across narratives begins to concentrate on simple, almost invisible actions, consistent ones. Stoicism calls this a return to what is essential, acting in accordance with what depends on us, without turning every step into discourse. Life starts being guided more by reason than by the need for expression. Carl Jung observed that real transformation occurs when a person withdraws energy from the persona and returns it to the self. In simple terms, this means stopping living for an image and starting to live for inner coherence. Excessive talking loses its purpose when there is no longer a need to sustain an artificial identity. Practical application begins quietly. In thought, a new criterion appears. Not everything needs to be put into words. Not every insight needs to be shared. Not every perception needs to become an explanation. Some understandings mature better in silence, tested by life before being named. The mind learns to recognize the impulse to speak as a signal, an internal warning. When the urgent desire to explain, justify, or narrate arises, reason pauses and asks, "What am I trying to avoid right now? What could be done instead of said?" This small shift changes everything. In emotions, application requires sobriety. Emotions still arise, but they no longer demand an audience. Sadness does not need to be narrated to exist. Frustration does not need to be shared to be valid. Joy does not need to be displayed to be real. Feeling stops being an automatic invitation to speak. It becomes an invitation to appropriate action. Sometimes the action is waiting. Sometimes it is adjusting boundaries. Sometimes it is simply continuing. In conversations, the change becomes visible. The person speaks less about themselves and listens more to the environment, not to please, but to perceive. Words gain weight because they are less frequent. When they speak, they do not explain their life. They speak what is necessary, what is useful, what is true in that moment. The need to convince disappears. The anxiety for validation fades. Silence stops being uncomfortable and becomes an ally. Silent boundaries grow stronger. One does not enter conversations that only feed the ego. One does not explain choices to those who do not need to understand them. One does not expose processes that are still under construction. This is not coldness. It is respect for one's own energy. Stoicism has always taught that inner dignity is protected more by what we avoid than by what we confront. Speaking less about one's own life is a way of avoiding dissipation, a way of preserving the center. In daily life, this posture shows up in small, firm actions. Following through on decisions without announcements, correcting habits without justification, ending cycles without long speeches, letting results speak. The final reflection is simple. Those who talk less about their own life begin to live more within it. Not because they have become closed off, but because they stopped outsourcing their sense of meaning. Life stops being a story that is told and becomes a path that is sustained. This requires emotional maturity. It requires accepting that not everything will be understood by others. It requires tolerating silence without filling it with explanations. It requires trusting that coherence, over time, speaks for itself. The world will keep asking. People will keep offering opinions. There will be moments when the urge to talk, explain, or defend returns. But reason now knows how to tell when words are a bridge and when they are an escape. Speaking less does not diminish life. It makes it more precise. If this reflection touched something true in you, it may be worth staying in this practice of inner sobriety. Subscribing to the channel is simply a way to continue this path with calm and depth. Liking the video helps keep this kind of content alive. And commenting, just a few words if you wish, is an honest way to mark what became clear in silence.